Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and a warm welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombanjo. Now tonight we focus on terrorism and the impact that it's having on the continent from both an economic and a political perspective. Terrorism is a global problem, but in Africa it undermines state institutions and delays much needed economic development. Now, following the recent terror attacks in Kenya, I spoke to Naima Jina, he's the executive director of the Afro-Middle East Center, about the rise of terrorist groups on the continent. Let's take a look.
Most of these groups operate either nationally or regionally. So Lord's Resistance Army, not just in one country, for example, 2 or 3 different countries. And they don't necessarily have a continent-wide agenda or field of operations. Groups in the DRC we've seen. So the agendas usually are national or span 1 or 2 countries. I'm not sure that we can easily point to trends that kind of characterize all of them. But certainly violent action, often targeting civilians, not all of them all the time, but often targeting civilians. Some of them operating in particular parts of the country. Boko Haram really only operating in the north, because that's where they want to kind of take control, the north of Nigeria. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, their kind of tactic has more been kidnapping and crime than anything else.
So no commonalities in terms of modus operandi. If we go back to the root causes, I mean, you've mentioned the word marginalization more than once, and of course described a lot of these areas or affected areas as unstable politically anyway, and where we've seen some sort of transition either into stability or out of stability. Can we then begin to draw or paint a specific picture about the kind of areas that are most likely to be affected by terror on the continent, which might give us a step ahead into what creates vulnerability?
Yes, so two things around that. One is that the ground becomes fertile and good environment is provided in areas where populations have grievances, feel marginalized, whether it's true or not. They have a perception of being marginalized and not getting the full benefits from the state or the community or whatever that they feel that they should. So in Nigeria, for example, Nigeria is a very stable country. But in the northern part of Nigeria, the population there feels that they're marginalized. And that allows the ground for Boko Haram to emerge. So it's in order to deal with terrorist activity, really the starting point should be the grievances that people have and marginalization that they have. The second one, of course, is that it's most likely or easiest to happen in places where there's instability. So 5 years ago, you wouldn't have thought that there'd be terrorist groups operating in Libya, for example, because it was such a repressive society. But in its repressiveness, it was stable. Right? But now you have ISIS operating there, people getting killed, etc. So in those countries where there's instability, Libya, Somalia, we know, etc., it's obviously easier to operate.
We're picking up reports that there is a potential collaboration among some of these terror groups, in particular ISIS, potentially coming together with Boko Haram. Others are dismissing this as just, a sensationalist ways of making headlines. Should we be paying more attention?
We should always be paying attention to the possibilities of collaboration. I don't think that at the moment there are the kinds of linkages and networks that some people are pointing to. So there's attempts to paint the whole African continent as being riddled by a kind of common terrorist group that is well networked and shares intelligence. I mean, that's not true. So the potential is always there as groups might expand their horizons or their agendas, but I don't think that is the case at the moment. A group like ISIS, though, does have a wing, if you like, in Libya. So that's on the continent, and we know that is the case. the link with Boko Haram is not as clear. Boko Haram seems to indicate at some points an allegiance to ISIS, but it's not really a connection.
Let's look at ISIS in a little bit more depth, and in particular look at infiltration. I mean, we speak about an African presence in Libya. How easy is it to penetrate different markets and begin to spread your presence into those markets?
You make it sound like terrorist groups or businesses. Maybe they are.
Maybe the business of terror.
ISIS is very rich.
Yeah.
No, it's you know, again, if there's instability, it's easier. If there's grievances that people have, it's easier to operate, to recruit, to conduct operations without being exposed to authorities, etc. So the market, if you like, in those countries certainly is available.
Let's talk about very quickly before I let you go, the political will to take on terror. It's very recent in my mind when we saw the terror attacks in Paris, and we saw how the European and North American leaders came out in full force and in fact marched against that terror attack. Does the African life seem to matter as much as European lives? Because it certainly seems from the perception of Africans who are not seeing the same level of reaction from their political leaders that African lives don't matter.
Well, I think African lives matter less to Europeans and North Americans, but they should be mattering much more to, they should matter much more to Africans and African leaders. And I think that even we have become a little immune to that, and we just take the statistics as they happen without looking at those things more in depth. African leaders certainly should have their eyes much more on their own populations, on the problems that their populations face, on the causes for which terrorist organizations are able to thrive in their countries and on the continent, and should be less concerned about the agendas of foreign powers on the continent, because foreign powers come in with the idea of security, but really it's about their own interests. So, for example, opening the door to the United States Africa Command, for example, which is now happening all over the African continent. They've had military exercises even with South Africa. That's not safe. That's a very dangerous move for African governments and African states themselves, and I think we need to be much more careful.
Joining me now, though, for more insight on the impact of terrorism on the economy is Anneli Botha. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. And on the line via Skype from Australia is Steve Killelea. He's the executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And they've recently published the Global Terrorism Index. Now, having said that, maybe let's start off with you, Steve, and get you to first talk to us about the index. What's the purpose of the Global Terrorism Index before we get to the findings that have come out?
Sure. Well, the aim of the Global Terrorism Index is to sort of compare the fabric of terrorism with 162 countries around the world. That covers about 96.7% of the population of the world. And then to do trends dating back to 2000, so we can see the changes in the fabric of terrorism over time. Then also to do some simple quantitative analysis around what these costs might be, and then also to look at the factors which are associated with terrorism, and also, just as importantly, the factors which are not.
And then what would be the key trends that have come out of the latest report that have significance for Africa?
Well, I think probably the most disturbing trend, I'll stick with a couple of global ones first, is that the year-on-year rise in terrorist deaths was 61%. That's up from 11,000 to 18,000. But combined with that, the number of countries which suffered greater than 50 deaths increased from 15 to 24. So not only are we seeing the intensity of terrorism increasing, we're also seeing the spread. And obviously we can see as it spreads, we're seeing a number of countries in Africa being affected. So Nigeria is obviously the one which is affected the most. So 2014, and these are very, very preliminary figures, more than 2,000 people died. Next was Somalia with about 640, Egypt 240, and then we moved down to Kenya at 206. But that obviously doesn't take in the recent tragedy at Guerrero.
Let's bring it back to you, Anneli, and let's get your view on really whether what we're hearing from Steve matches the trends that the Institute for Security Studies is finding on the ground in an African context.
Well, my personal interest, basically going back further from 2000, and what Steve mentioned is extremely interesting from an analysis perspective. But I think Africa has been hit quite a few times. It's not a new phenomenon on a continent. Yes, you have your hotspots, and Nigeria, Somalia, the Maghreb area. But if you trace back these groups, they have a very strong and a very long history. You can trace them back to the 1980s. If I take, for example, Algeria had 20 years of extreme acts of terrorism. So it's definitely given us a very interesting picture in terms of 2000 and beyond. Keep in mind that you also have 9/11 that also cost quite a few people's lives. And so we have to see it in context, not only focusing on these are the facts. There's no problem with it, but just see the context of it as well, because it can give the impression that terrorism is now new.
Right, and very recently, and I guess many Africans are also waking up to the frequency of terrorist attacks. We've just had the Kenyan incident at Garissa University. You say this has been going on for many, many years. Yes. Would you then also concede that governments have failed to adequately address terror attacks on the African continent?
Well, let's go back a bit again in history. All of these groups start off as domestic organizations. Al-Shabaab, Somalia. Boko Haram, for example, now in Nigeria. Previously, you have the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, you have the Allied Democratic Forces in Uganda. The focus completely domestic. There was no interest of hitting targets beyond their reach. Over time, no domestic terrorism group stays domestic. That is the reality. And that is why we see a transnationalization of terrorist organizations. So in the case of Al-Shabaab, it's now hitting Kenya. Previously had a massive attack in Uganda. There is growing influence in Tanzania.
Right. So we're definitely seeing a transnational pattern developing. Let's go back to you, Steve, and maybe let's pull in the point that Anneli makes about a transnational development, rather, in the tactics that terrorist groups are using. Is this the future of terrorism going forward, that we're never likely to see domestically confined attacks, but more trying to penetrate as many markets and as many countries as possible?
I think the points on terrorism has been with us for a long while is very apt and accurate. Certainly if we went back to, let's say, the mid-80s, height of the Cold War, terrorism through Africa was very strong. But what was happening then, it was mainly political or secessionist type terrorism. I think the big change which we've seen since 2000 is the rise of the Islamic groups, and a lot of these have transnational agendas. So if you look at, let's say ISIL, they're really about trying to create a caliphate in the Levant region, and that takes in 6 countries in the Middle East. And also, if we look at Al-Qaeda and the way these groups and its affiliates, the way these groups, they spring up, they morph, and they change. I think one of the points which I think was really most fascinating for me out of the study was looking at a study which Rand Corporation did going back to the mid-60s of 200, I think it was about 260 different terrorist groups which had actually ceased operating. Of them, 7% were defeated militarily, 10% actually achieved their aims, but about a bit over 80% of them ceased to existence through a combination of policing and political process. But once the terrorist groups got over about 1,000 fighters, then you did need military intervention.
Well, what we've done so far is really just begin to scrape the surface to try and understand the key trends and patterns of terrorism on the African continent. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we begin to make that link between terrorism and foreign direct investment and economic growth on the continent. Stay tuned for that conversation. Back to Invest Africa. Tonight we're talking about terrorism and the impact that it's having on the continent. Remember that you can be a part of these conversations. You can tweet us at CNBC Africa using the hashtag Invest Africa, or you can follow me at The Real Nosy. Still with me, my guest, Anneli Botha. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, and Steve Killelea. He's the executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Let's start off with you, Anneli, in this segment, and let's begin to create a linkage between terrorism and economic risk. Are we seeing that there are particular economies on the African continent who might have regressed in terms of their economic growth because of the prevalence of terror attacks?
Well, the main objective of any terrorist organization, especially its execution of attacks, is to intimidate. And the intimidation factor also immediately have an impact towards the business community as well, especially foreign investment. You don't want to invest in an area or a country that is unstable. So that is definitely the first link, I would say, that plays a very, very important role.
That's an interesting observation. And Steve, allow me to draw a comparison here, because of course 9/11 was perhaps one of the most visible terror attacks globally, but this results in a shrinking of foreign direct investment or investment activity in the US. And the reason why I ask this is that why is it that in an African context terror attacks would directly have an impact on the economic and investment activity in that market?
Yeah, I think the answers to this are very complicated. We'll start with a couple of simple things, and we'll just look at statistical analysis, which we had. What the factors which were most prevalent in creating terrorist environments weren't actually economic. They weren't per capita income. In fact, economic indicators didn't actually play a large part in it, but foreign direct investment did. It had quite a strong correlation. So now, if we looked at, let's say, Nigeria in 2010, the IMF estimated that foreign direct investment fell 30%. So as an investor investing in another country, a lot of it is done on an emotive basis. So let's say you're looking at investing in two telco countries, you had, let's say, Turkey and you had Nigeria, and the telco was going to be in the Niger Delta. You'd stack up the economics of the two telcos you were thinking investing in, and then after you'd done that analysis, you'd look at the other factors, risk factors associated with it, and one of it, you'd look at the terrorism, and rather looking and quantifying the level of terrorism, you'd move by your impression. That's really probably the reality of it. If we looked at homicides, for example, 2013, there were 40 times as many deaths from homicides as there was from terrorist attacks. So we come back to it. In a lot of ways, investment can be a motive. Now, if we're looking at the US, it's such a large economy, about 23%, let's say today, of the global GDP. As an investor, and you want exposure to global markets, it's hard not to be there.
Let's take this explanation, let's bring it and extrapolate it to Kenya, Anneli, and an economy that is heavily reliant on tourism. And we've seen the impact that terror attacks have had on that particular sector. Give us a sense of the sectors that are most at risk when it comes to terror attacks in an African context.
I would say, I mean, in the case of Kenya, for example, the tourism attraction, you have the Masai Mara and you have the coastal region of Kenya. That is your main tourist attractions. The Masai Mara, people still visit, not a problem. It's relatively safe. But the coastal region, Mombasa, Garissa, and beyond, Lamu, that whole entire area, that attracts a lot of tourists, now immediately feel, you know what, is it really safe to come and visit these particular countries? And that have an impact, basically a ripple impact in terms of the tourism industry. The tourism industry have an impact in terms of that development in that particular area, and development plays a role. If you look at the reasons why the Mombasa Republican Council came to existence, it's a sense of we are completely disregarded. Everything is happening in Nairobi, we are being completely left out. So that is enforcing this whole process moving forward. So it is not only the tourism industry, it is definitely the entire country that start to suffer.
I want to come back to the point you raised now about inequality as a driver of terrorism. But before we do that, Steve, let me come back to you and on the back of trying to understand the sectors within the economy that are most vulnerable. Can we wrap our heads around the actual cost of terrorism to an economy?
Gets very, very difficult to do. So we're looking at the estimates, let's say, of 9/11 in the US. Notice with them, they range in 4 times the estimates. There's some simple ways of which we've used to sort of try and calculate the economic costs. So one is we look at the number of people who are killed. We look at the per capita income. We now multiply the deaths by the per capita income, then the lifetime earnings of those people, which on average would say is 40 years, and then you use a multiplier effect for the flow-on effects through the economy. So if we looked at Nigeria, for example, with approximately 2,000 deaths in 2014, that'd be about $2.2 billion to the economy. Now, there are other factors, because as the terrorism starts to increase, it moves more into a conflict situation than a terrorist situation. Now, that has very substantial flow-on effects through the economy. And I think the comment sort of also how dependent is a particular economy on FDIs, and particularly tourism. It's a very good point. That'll vary from economy to economy. We all know that the coastal regions of Kenya are very dependent on tourism.
I want to take a very sector-specific one on this, Anneli, and in particular maybe take a look at the insurance sector and how premium costs might be driven through the roof because of increased prevalence of terror in a particular region, essentially making the cost of doing business in that market unpalatable.
Yes. I mean, it's a clinical way of looking at it, in the sense of, you know what, as you've mentioned, what do we do with insurance? On the other hand, you have massive destruction of property. As we've heard, the question of the loss of life. And I think that is probably the most serious part of it. And the investment part and the insurance part, yes, that is definitely important. But the question is, how many of these countries have such an insurance industry that we have? You don't see the same type of involvement in terms of insurance companies.
And I think the point that you're making, which is so important, is that if we take the Garissa University example, the loss of life there is so much more important because you actually have young minds that could have brought further industrialization to the economy and created jobs and the like. Maybe let's go back to the issue of inequality. And Steve, I want to come back to you with this. Anneli raised saying that at the core of terrorism oftentimes is an unequal society. Wouldn't it make sense then that if governments work towards eradicating poverty and balancing out income inequality within the population, that this might be a step forward to maybe trying to take on the terror? Anneli is shaking her head in Johannesburg, but let's get your take first.
Okay, I think it's our analysis showed that there are a number of factors which were associated with terrorism. This is not violence in general, because there's very strong linkage between poverty and violence in general. But for terrorism, you need a level of group grievances. So that's really the inequality of one group as against another, rather than right through society. Lack of political legitimacy by the state, and also levels of state-sponsored terror. And by this I mean high levels of extrajudicial killings, torture by the state, and then a general level of lawlessness through the environment as well. So now, one of the other things which we found looking at this, so there are 4 different terrorist groups which were responsible for 66% of the terrorist deaths globally in 2013. So there were ISIL, Boko Haram, Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda are active in Africa. Now, all of them subscribe to a form of a really radical form of Wahhabi philosophies as taught through Salafist schools. And if we look at Boko Haram and translate the name, it literally means against Western education. So come back to Garissa. Right. So for me, it's a lot more than just hitting poverty and inequality. There's need to sort of re-educate Sunnis around moderate and more peaceful forms of Sunni philosophies.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I just want to get a final comment from Anneli. Sorry to cut you off there, Steve. A very quick one. The kind of policy directive or advice you would give to a government that is faced by terror in as short a time as possible?
Well, be realistic. Don't only think that a military solution is going to work, so be realistic, and take in consideration that your actions will have consequences. And that is the most important for me.
Well, on that point, that's where we wrap up this show. It's been quite insightful in light of what we've seen in Africa in recent weeks. A very big thank you to my guest. That's Anneli Botha. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. And Steve Killelea, he's the executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Now, please remember that you can send us your comments. The details are on your screen. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye.